All right, you lovely people. Let's wrap up this unit. We're just starting the unit. Let's wrap up this module, shall we, on psychological egoism. Recall one last time, psychological egoism is the theory of human motivation, claiming that a person primarily acts according to prudence. And of course, we've been looking at this strong version of psychological egoism that says a person will always act prudentially. That is, again, according to their own interests, that making altruism, a concern for the interests of others, impossible or abnormal. And so far, we've seen some challenges that psychological egoism has. The first challenge was that difficulty in really defining what we mean by prudence and self-interest in this context, this thing that's supposed to be driving us nonstop. And we saw defining that it's not as easy as it might seem at first. It's a challenge. One must be careful in that. And the second challenge we just saw now was the suggestion that psychological egoism seems to confuse the object of what it is we want, or, we're confusing the objects of our wants with either the wants themselves or with the satisfaction of getting those objects. But again, the focus we saw with those challenges is on, the object. The objects of our wants or our satisfaction determine whether something is being prudent self-interest or not. And as we've seen, if the object is power and control over others, I think we all can understand how that seems to be kind of prudent it is prudent self-interest. Yeah, we understand how that works. But if the object really is about helping others, and especially when that helping of others requires small or maybe even major sacrifice on our part, that does not seem like prudent self-interest. That seems to be more altruistic, certainly caring about others, right? It seems possible. We see that all the time. So those are some of the challenges. Now I'd like to present two more challenges in psychological egoism before we wrap this module up. Now, the first of these challenges is what James Rachels calls the deep error of psychological egoism. The deep error, it's so dramatic. It's a tricky, subtle one, so read that section carefully. I will go over it as well, but it's a tricky little argument, but one that I think is very powerful and important. And I do think that if you ever meet a philosopher, most philosophers are not fans of psychological egoism, and this is the argument they're probably going to make about why they think psychological egoism fails. So what's this challenge? This comes from Karl Popper. Now, he was a very famous philosopher of science. He really was interested. How does science work? How do scientific theories work? Especially, what makes them scientific? What makes them theories? Oh, it's fun. There's a class on philosophy of science here at UB you can take from Neil Williams. It's great. Now, Popper, this famous philosopher of science, he did not like Freudian theories of psychology. He was not a fan. And he said he did not think Freudian theory was scientific. That is, Freudian theory certainly looks like a scientific theory of psychology because Freudian theory is trying to explain and understand how human behavior works, what motivates us. So it looks like a scientific theory of psychology. But Popper's problem with Freudian theory was that no matter what empirical evidence we produce, Freudian theory always seems to give us the exact same explanation, that the motivation for human behavior is sexual in nature, right? Women want to have a penis. Men are happy that they got one, but men want to sleep with their mothers, whereas the women want to sleep with their fathers. Everything, oh my God, on this theory seems to be just about sex. Great, that's going to end up on YouTube, isn't it? Anyway. But if a person, according to Freudian theory though, because this was Popper's concern, is if a person shows no sign of sexual motivation, the person says, no, this had nothing to do with sex. Freudian's theory then just says, oh, your denial of sexual motivation proves the sexual motivation because you're repressing your sexual feelings. You gotta let it out, man. You're in denial. So no matter what empirical evidence a person can provide about behavior, there is no way you can prove that this isn't about sexual motivation. Because if you admit it's sexual motivation, Freudian theory says, I'm glad you can finally admit that. But if you deny This had nothing to do with sexual motivation at all. I was just buying a hamburger for dinner. Oh, you're repressing your sexual desire as expressed by buying the hamburger, I guess. So again, we can draw a similar Venn diagram that we saw with psychological egoism, and we can discover that if you try to point out human motivation that exists outside of that sexual motivation circle, Freudian theory will create some kind of rationalization that says, nope, that's also really about sex, and the circle just seems to expand and expand and expand and expand, covering more and more human behavior until it seems that it's not even logically possible to have human behavior that doesn't involve sex at some level. And so Popper looks at this and he's like, I'm a little suspicious here. Because it seems now that there's literally no empirical evidence that can logically count against the theory. Because no matter what you produce, there is some kind of rationalization or trickery that makes it about sex. So what Popper says, and this is the classic line from Popper, he says that this theory of Freudian analysis seems to be unfalsifiable. That is, Freudian theory is based on an unfalsifiable hypothesis because, look, it appears that it's grounded on empirical evidence about human behavior. The theory isn't, because it's not falsifiable. Again, as the picture shows, we already know in advance that there is no logical empirical evidence that could ever show that Freudian theory is wrong. It seems to have just literally defined everything as sexual in nature. But that's not scientific anymore, because there's a whole, let's do an example. Take our good old friend Isaac Newton, who, you've probably studied him at some point, Isaac Newton's theory of gravity. Now, look, it is logically possible to disprove this theory of gravity. If I drop this pen and it suddenly floats up, that's logically possible. It's logically possible that could happen. It just doesn't. Every time we do the experiment, it falls down. But in fact, Albert Einstein, if you've ever studied what Albert Einstein actually did, he actually constructed a very clever experiment that showed there was a problem with Isaac Newton's theory, and the theory had to change with the introduction of general and special relativity. I forget which one. It's been too long. The physics majors can correct me on Twitter. Make sure you hashtag me so I can be like, oh, you got me. But again, the claim is that Freudian theory is not like that, because there's no experiment we could ever construct to see even logically what would it look like for a person to violate Freudian theory, because Freudian theory keeps making it about sex. Again, the more you deny it's about sex, apparently the Freudian thinks, no, it really is about sex. And it's like, well, that's not fair. But I will say this. My dad is a therapist, and so I know a little bit about Freud, about the real Freud. And Freud did, after all, I don't know if Freud ever actually said this, but the idea makes sense, is that Freud is supposed to have said, look, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. It's not, something else. It's just, yeah, it's fine. You're having a night out with friends, smoke a cigar. There's nothing sexual in that. So anyway, but I hope at least you can see the problem of this unfalsifiability. The idea that something is not scientific, it's definitely not a scientific theory of psychology, if there's no logical way to disprove or test whether it's true or not. Again, a scientific theory, any scientific theory, and a scientific theory of psychology has to be able to be tested. And being tested means it is at least logically possible that the theory is wrong. It fails the test. And indeed, that's how psychology has been working. That's why we've moved on from Freud. We found other things that might drive people besides sex. Look, sex might be an important big thing. No one's denying that. But that doesn't mean it's literally everything. And so James Rachel's concern is that psychological egoism seems to be doing the exact same thing. That is, psychological egoism looks like an empirical theory of psychology about how people behave, human nature, whatever you want to call it. But then psychological egoism claims that even the most altruistic behavior is also self-interested. And look, if even the firefighters on 9/11 were really acting in their own self-interest by running into that building and dying, then I'm not clear what could ever logically count as not being self-interested. We seem to have gone too far. And as such, psychological egoism is no longer scientific. It's no longer psychological. It's something else and something not very interesting. So that's a pretty big challenge to overcome. We need to have a test to be able to test this theory. And James Rachel's is pretty clear that once you devise a test that's an honest test that can actually test out whether psychological egoism is true or not, he said it's going to fail the test. You'll always find someone somewhere being altruistic or, caring about other people. But again, if it's unfalsifiable, it's no longer about psychology and it's inherently meaningless. Because there's no logical way to test it or prove or disprove it. It's just trivially true. And so again, it has to be logically possible and for any theory of science, and in psychology as a science, to be tested. And so it has to be logically possible to prove a psychological claim. You have to test it and prove whether it's true or not. So again, that's the deep error of psychological egoism. It's unfalsifiable. It admits of no test. Because if you gave a test, it would probably fail. Someone would be altruistic somewhere. Okay, so much for that. I'm going to present one last challenge now. This is my favorite because it's kind of cute. You know me, I like the cute arguments. And this is the idea that psychological egoism may just ultimately rest on an utterly meaningless definition of prudent self-interest. So we're going back to kind of the concerns that started us about how do we define self-interest? How do we define prudence? And so let me give an example first of what a meaningless definition looks like. So suppose you defined yellow as any color on the visible light spectrum. So yeah, you define yellow as any color on the visible light spectrum. I hope you can see that this definition of yellow is pretty meaningless because yellow is supposed to denote a particular color. Not all the colors, a particular color. That's what yellow is supposed to be doing. Again, yellow is supposed to distinguish one type of color from lots of other kinds of colors. But you cannot do this if yellow is literally all the colors, or it can be any of the colors. So yellow is meaningless. Plus, as a bonus, or maybe even more than a bonus, another serious problem, of course, that's not even what normal people mean by yellow. Obviously, the usual notion of yellow is a very specific range of colors on the color spectrum. Again, not all of them. Now, we can apply this same argument. I'll use almost the exact same language, but we'll replace yellow with psychological egoism's notion of self-interest. So again, the really strong defenders, the strong defenders of strong psychological egoism seem to ultimately define self-interest as any interest the self has. But that makes self-interest a meaningless term. Here's why. Because self-interest, as the original Venn diagram I showed you, was supposed to denote a particular type or a particular set of interests. But self-interest is not supposed to denote all of the possible interests. Self-interest is supposed to be distinguishing certain types of motives from other types of motives. And again, we cannot do this if self-interest is literally all the possible motives. Logically, everything is, it's just like yellow becomes all the colors and it's meaningless. Similarly, self-interest can't become all the interests. It's only supposed to be a certain set of those interests, not all of them. So again, if self-interest becomes all the interests by definition, then it's a meaningless definition. And as a bonus, as we've mentioned repeatedly now so far, this isn't even what normal people mean by self-interest. Again, the usual meaning of self-interest is talking about a very specific type of interests that the person has. Again, it's the interests that seem to be greedy, selfish, going after the things they only care about, not the interest about helping others, caring for others. Again, we're back to that idea that it's the object of your interests that determines whether or not it's self-interested. Again, if the object is power and control of others, greed, fame, money, whatever, those things, yes, those seem to be pretty self-interested. But if the object is helping others, caring about others, feeling pity, empathy, these do not seem to sound like self-interest anymore. All right. So I think I've covered all the reasons that explain why philosophers do not endorse strong psychological egoism. Look, yes, people may genuinely be selfish. I think if you think people always have your interests at heart, your mom, I hope, does, and your family members do, and your friends, I hope, do, but generally strangers, it's pretty tough. strangers can be pretty darn selfish. We see that a lot. Nothing unusual there. But to claim that literally everyone is like that, no, come on. There are people in your life you love and whose successes bring you joy, and it's nothing about being greedy or selfish in that. Like Glaucon from Plato's Republic and Joey from TV's show Friends, they're going too far. That strong psychological egoism doesn't seem to be true. Because look, if once we get that meaningful definition that can be tested, that clearly draws the line between what's prudent and outside of prudence, we're going to see people behaving on both sides of that line all the time. It's never going to be on only one side of that line. And so we'll always find altruistic behavior that disproves the strong psychological egoism. Again, weak psychological egoism, that people tend to be self-interested, that could very well be true. But that's not what we've been talking about. We've been talking about the claim that literally everyone is self-interested. Now we've seen lots of challenges for that. So, that's probably more, as always, too much, I know. But I like it. It's fun. If you don't like it, just watch me at a faster speed. I repeat myself enough, you'll catch it all eventually. But for everyone that's still stuck around, let's remove that arm flab. My favorite part of the module. Yeah, remove that arm flab. Pat yourself on the back. You're almost done with another module. So what's left? Take the quiz. Throw out some tweets. Physicists, correct me in my stuff about physics. Psychologists, correct me about my understanding of Freudian theory. That's fine. I love to learn from you guys. You guys are smart too. Anyway, finish all that stuff up and you should be all good. And so as for me, I'll see you here back when you're ready for your next module. We'll talk about ethical egoism. Ooh, what could that be? I know, we can't wait to find out. But until then, you know what to do. Take care. Stay safe.